Hashem, today's daf yomi is Sanhedrin daf Pei, Sanhedrin 80. And we're going to start on the top of Pei Amid Aleph. Today's daf is dedicated for a Shmir for the Chayalim, Atzal for the Shvuyim, Yeshua for Am Yisrael, and this Eis Tzara. The daf yomi was discussing a line in the Mishnah which stated that a Rotseach, which technically speaks means a murderer who get mixed up with others, there's a dispute between the Rabbanon and Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbanon said all of them are exempt. And Rabbi Yehuda says you stick the murderer into a kippah, which is basically a small room where the murderer will then die on its own. You won't actively kill it, but passively you'll kill this murderer. So what is this scenario? So the Gemara offers two positions, the position of Shmuel and the position of Reish Lakish. Shmuel's position is that we're referring to a scenario where there's a whole bunch of murderers, and mixed in with them was a person who was just on trial for murder, and all the evidence was heard, and they're about to convict, but then he got mixed up. And since we don't know exactly who he is, we can't continue to proceed with the case, because you have to have Achel and Ingmardino, you have to have the defendant in front of the judges. So therefore, Shmuel says, Rabbanan say he's exempt, and Rabbi Yehuda says stick him into the kippah. Whereas Reish Lakish says no, because in that case, they'd all be exempt. So rather, Reish Lakish says the murderer here is an ox. And so according to the Rabbanan, we say he's exempt, because you could just stick all the oxen that were ready to be executed, you put them into you're exempt here. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you stick them into the kippah. So now Amar Rava says on top of Pei Amid Aleph, no, I have a problem with both of your approaches, because there's a Brisa which comments on our Mishnah, and that doesn't work with either of your approaches. That which we study in the Brisa, it states, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Afilu Abba Chalafta Beinei, and Rabbi Yossi said that this is their position, even if Abba Chalafta was amongst them. Now, this doesn't work according to Reish Lakish, who says it's the oxen, because whether the Abba Chalafta wouldn't be there with the oxen, and it doesn't work according to the Rabbanan, because if Abba Chalafta was a murderer, why should it matter? So it doesn't work with either approach. So therefore, Rava gives a different approach, which is predicated on the assumption that the text is actually missing some words, and there's earlier words. So he says, Halchikamar. We have to assume another scenario. Shnayim shayu omdin. If there were two people who were standing together, v'yad sachetz mimeneim, and an arrow went out from between them, v'harag, and then it killed somebody, Shneim Peturin. Both of them will be exempt. And about that, Rabbi Yossi says, even if Abba Chalafta was amongst them, meaning to say, you know for sure that Abba Chalafta didn't kill him because he's such a tzaddik, gadol ador, still nevertheless, we would say that everybody's exempt, because we don't know for sure that it wasn't Abba Chalafta. Mishor Shenigmar Dino, and then we have the next case about an ox who was sentenced to death, that was mixed up with other oxen who were not sentenced to death or not guilty of murder. Sokonosan, we stone all the oxen, because Rashi explains. Now, what's the reason why the Rabbanan say Sokon? Because you can't get benefit from any of them, because one ox is mixed in. And so therefore it's not batal, because it's still in its extant state. And so therefore the Rabbanan say we might as well fulfill the mitzvah of the rabbis of the Torah of stoning an ox under these circumstances. Where Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we don't want to be matriach the court and make them stone the ox. So we just put all the oxen into a room and let them die on its own. And we have a brisa that supports this reading of Tanya, which is binichusa, which is to support. Let's say there's a cow that killed somebody and then it gave birth. If it gave birth before the cow was sentenced to death, then vada mutar, then the offspring will be permitted. If after the cow was sentenced to death, it gave birth, vada aser, then the offspring is prohibited. If it got mixed up with others, Konsenos Sama Kippah. We stick it into the Kippah. That's the position of Rabbi Yehuda, whereas Rabbi Elazar Shimon says, Mevino Sama Bezdim is Sokonos. And since one of them is liable for stoning, we bring them all to the court and stone them. And that's like the position of the Rabbanon, according to this new reading of the Mishnah that Rava suggests. So now the Gemara is going to analyze this brayso. Amar Mar, Imach Nigmar Dina Yolda, after the cow gave birth, before the verdict was issued, then the vada is mutter. But why? But why? Once it gored, it was pregnant. And Rava said, that if there was a fetus that was part of the goring, it's going to be prohibited because the cow gored with the offspring. And Vlad on her boss, and if there was a cow that was engaged in bestiality, also he who Vlad in their foe, then everything is prohibited, even the fetus, because the cow and its fetus were engaged in bestiality. So we see that even if it took place, even if it took place before even if the verdict was issued, even if the verdict was issued after the cow gave birth, the fetus should still be prohibited. So the Gemara says, okay, we have to amend the text of this brayso to read consistent with the statement of Rava. Ema achlo nigmar dina ibra. So when did it become pregnant? If it became pregnant before the case was decided, v'yalda, meaning after the goring, it became pregnant, and then it gave birth, v'ada mutar, before the verdict was issued, then the offspring will be permitted. But if after the verdict was issued, Ibra became pregnant, V'yolda, and then it gave birth, V'ada Aser, then the offspring will be prohibited, because Rashi says it was born from something that's prohibited, and something born from something prohibited is prohibited, even though it wasn't there during the time of the goring. Gemara says, but this only works on Nichoman Amar Zev is Gorem Aser. So this only works because one of the sources of this baby was the father, and the father is not prohibited. So this is a dispute in Tamura that if you say Zev is Gorem, that if there are two factors that are causing it, as long as one of them is prohibited, the other one, then the offspring will be prohibited. So in this case, we could say, since the mother was prohibited, so the offspring will be prohibited. But what about on the top of Tayam Abayz, Elamanda Amar, but according to the Shita that says, Zev is Gorem Mutar, that if there's two sources and one of them is permitted, then the offspring will be permitted. Ma'ikol Meimer, how would you explain, how would basically Rava, or how would the Gemara explain this statement? So therefore, the Gemara says, Amar Ravina, so therefore Ravina says we have to say, Ema Achlo Nigmar Dina, Ibra V'yolda V'ada Mutter. If before the case was decided, the mother became pregnant and gave birth, the offspring is permitted. Vim Achlo Nigmar Dina, Ibra. But if it became pregnant before the case was decided, when Misha Nigmar Dina Yolda, Vlada Asar. But if the matter became decided before the mother became pregnant before it was decided, but once it was decided she gave birth, then the offspring will be prohibited, not because of Zev Gorem is prohibited, but because Ubar Yerech Imahu, because we're going to say that the fetus is considered like one of the limbs of the mother. And so therefore, when it was decided, it became prohibited along with it. So now we say, the Gemara says, it said in our Mishnah that anyone who's liable for death, if they got mixed up with another one who's liable for death, we give them the less severe penalty. And Rabbi Shimon says the less severe penalty is stoning, not burning. And the Rabbanan say, no, it's burning and not stoning. Sreifa, not skila. So Shema Mina, Gemara says from the fact that you could give it the less severe penalty, we see from here, Musro Adavar Chamor, have a Musro Adavar Kal, that if you're warned about a more severe penalty, we say that automatically you're also warned for the lesser penalty. So that's the chiddush of our Mishnah. So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, no, that's not. You can't learn that out because this is a specific case. Kigon shehasru bo stam. They just warned him stam. They didn't warn him for any specific type of death. V'aytanu, and the Tana of our Mishnah is like the following Tana of the Brisa. The Tanya we learned, Mishar Chayve Misu Shebetorah, Aim Misino. So unlike the Masis, which doesn't require warning, all the other deaths of the Torah, Aim Misino. So we only execute him if there's Adam, if there's witnesses, V'asra, and a warning, and until you make him known, Shulchayim Misas Bezdin, and until you make him known that he's liable for death from the court. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not enough just to tell him that he's liable for death. You have to tell him which type of death. And so the Tanakhama of this price is like our Mishnah, that you can just warn him stam, and you don't have to tell him which type of death he's getting. That's sufficient. What's the source of the Tanakhama? Yoav Mimikoshesh. He learned that from the Mikoshesh because he knew he was liable for death, the one who gathered the wood, but they didn't know what type of death. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mikoshesh Shorashai. So he said, no, the Mikoshesh was an exceptional circumstance. It was based upon God's decree. And so therefore we can't learn out from there for future generations. So now the Gemara says, Haniskoim ben Israfin, that it said in the Mishnah that if those who are being stoned were mixed up with those who are being burnt, we're going to have to give them, according to Rabbi Shimon, we give them all stoning. But the majority, the implication of these words is that the majority of the people there are chayav misa from Sreifa. So Mas Nila, Rabbi Yechezkel. So when Rabbi Yechezkel taught this to his son Rami Bray, he said on Israfim ben Iskorim, if those who are being burnt were mixed up with those who are being burnt, hold on 1 second, I want to just look at something. Just looking back at the actual text here, okay. When Rabbi Yechezkel taught this to Rami, his son, he switched around the order. Our Mishnah says on Iskon ben Israfin. When Rabbi Yechezkel taught it to Rami, his son, he said on Israfin ben Iskon, that if the ones who are being burnt are the minority, and they got mixed up with those who are being stoned, who are the majority, Rabbi Shimon says under those circumstances, Yadunu b'skila, you adjudicate them with stoning. Shasreifa chamura, because burning is more severe, and you give him the less severe penalty. But the problem is, Amrle Rav Yehuda, is Rabbi Yechezkel's son, Rav Yehuda, said to his father, Abba lotis niachi. No, you reversed it. It shouldn't be on Itzrafim ben Iskon, which implies that the skila ones are the majority. Because then maybe the reason why Rabbi Shimon says they get stoning is not because stoning is less severe, but maybe it's because stoning him is the majority. So he said, don't learn it like that, because my area desreifa chamura. Because why would you assume that the reason is because burning is more severe? Typically, the Ruben Niskolaninu. We're not learn this law from the fact that the majority of them are being stoned, and therefore we follow the majority. So it says Rabbi Chaz, go back to its son. So what should I learn? And it's from Rabbi ben Israfin. If those who are being stoned are the minority and they got mixed up in those being burnt, who are the majority, Rabbi Shimon says Yaduna b'skila shasreifa chamura. Rabbi Shimon says give them stoning because burning is more severe. Well, if that's the case, says Rabbi Yechezkel, but what about the next clause? Yaduna b'sreifa. Chachamim say that under those circumstances you still give him burning shaskila chamura because stoning is more severe. But don't say that the reason is because stoning is more severe. Typically, you could learn it out the Ruben Israfin, because the majority under these circumstances are going to be burnt. So therefore, that's the reason why we're going to give them burning, not because stoning is more severe. So the Gemara says, so that was what So that's Rabbi Yechezkel's retort back to his son, Rav Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yechezkel's retort back to his son. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda responds, no, awesome Rabbanan Uda Kamerle Rabbi Shimon. No, that's the Rabbanan just responding to Rabbi Shimon. With the Dach, the Amr Streifa Chamura, according to you, who said burning is more severe, it's not the case. Skila is Chamura. Meaning to say that which when the Chum say that stoning is more severe, that's not the reason for their law, but the reason is because why it gets burned is because the majority is Sreifa. And what's the reason why they say, but they're just saying, according to you, don't even think that because stoning is more severe than burning. So Amalei Shmuel and Rabbi Yehuda, Shmuel said to Rabbi Yehuda, his student, you might have been right about the law, but you were wrong about the way you corrected your father. Shinina, oh sharp one, you shouldn't really, we're on top of 81a, you should not be speaking to your father in this manner. Netanya, because we learned in the Brisa, Hare Shahaya Aviv over al Divrei Torah. If your father was violating the words of the Torah, you shouldn't say to him, Abba, Varta al Divrei Torah. Father, you violated the words of the Torah. You shouldn't say that to your father. Rather, you should say, Ela Omer lo Abba, Kach Kasiv b'Torah. Meaning, Rashi says, you read this as a question. Is this what is written in the Torah? Meaning, you ask him the question. But the Gemara doesn't like that approach either. That's really the same thing because you're embarrassing him. Ella, rather, what you should do is Omer lo Abba. You should say Mikra Kasa b'Torah. You should just show your father that there's a verse in the Torah that says this, and on his own, the father will understand that what he said in another context is not appropriate, and he'll correct himself. Okay, so that's an important point, not just about correcting one's father, but also about the fact that the knowledge of the Torah doesn't mean that you get to forget about basic decency and respect to others. We'll continue now because we, Baruch Hashem, we have a few more minutes. So